Rick and Gorna, which became the new nickname for her since Gornaritia was a very long name to pronounce by human standards, became a very hot topic to any ears that heard them, especially since what's happening shouldn't be possible. But then again, many would mention that life finds a way. Gorna was in fact creating an egg and would theoretically soon lay it. The pain she was feeling that made her double over was due to the unusual size of the egg itself. It was over 10% larger than it should be, and once this information reached her government, they would immediately send a specialty. Gorna herself was immediately taken off duty, and the Beyond the Rim was made immediately for the nearest hospital station or ship that had adequate facilities. The closest one to where they were at that moment was in the humans' known space stations, at least the few that still remained. On the way, the word had spread about the incident. Every species that found out that a human may be able to reproduce with a Fertian, well, this is unprecedented, and this is something every species wants to know about. With the Beyond the Rim well outside human territory at this point, it was seemingly undefended. Every criminal/pirate that realized that this mother and or child will be worth a hell of a lot of money made best speed. Yet no one wanted to face off against the humans. They remember what the humans did during their previous conflict. Ghastly was the word used, so they needed to be smart. Waiting near one of the jump nodes, a multitude of ships just waited there. They didn't communicate with each other, but none of them had any illusions on why they were there. The Beyond the Rim jumped in and was immediately surrounded. As even more ships arrived, the blockade became thicker, too thick to pierce through at that point. The comms were immediately jammed, packed with orders for the Beyond the Rim to surrender, but the captain had other ideas. Immediately, he deployed the weapons, and he told his helmsman, "Don't you dare fucking stop." The entire bridge crew could make out the plethora of calls to surrender the Fertian female and her mate. The response was simple: come and get them. No one wanted to risk the mother, as she was the prize, but they had to do something as the Beyond the Rim began blasting away with every weapon system it had. This is the first time most of them have actually seen human firepower, and for many, it would be their last. Human weapon systems ran hot as ships tried to take out the weapon systems themselves and use magnetic grapplers to bound themselves to the ship and attempt to board it. All this while being shot up and fighting off others trying to do the same thing, all while the Beyond the Rim was fighting and tearing all the ships apart, cutting them into pieces if necessary. Think of it as the universe's worst game of King of the Hill. In a very short time, the ship is fighting the engines of a ship that has its magnetic grapplers on it. The weapon systems, still functional, are spraying in all directions trying to keep all the others back, dragging along with it several cables that have been ripped off and are now behind it as it tries to accelerate, as they then had their cables somewhat cut, but there's a trick to that. Realizing they couldn't just cut the cables directly with their weapons, many of them constantly said, "Fucking pirates!" And in the melee, the Rim loses all of its weapon systems. This leaves it vulnerable as being held by the grapplers. The pirates have beaten each other for the prize so much that only one other ship remains. From the outside, it actually looks worse than the Beyond the Rim. So much so that both ships are now basically adrift. With no way to relieve the grapplers, the ships slowly drift around each other. Eventually, the cables from the grapples pull taut and draw the ships into each other. The impact would send all those inside flying in unknown directions. With the main engines offline, the crew only really has life support inside. They do have a few other pieces, but not many. Gorna, like so many others, is getting sick from all the changes of motion and spin. With this being a human ship, they can use the few maneuvering thrusters, but they need to get those Xenos off their back somehow. On the bridge, they could hear Ricky's voice as he called for the captain. Still trying to get main power online, the captain responded with, "What?" Ricky, standing next to an airlock with a suit, actually said, "Sir, permission to leave the ship." "Why? What for?" the captain said. Ricky responded, "To say hi to our friends and get there and cut us free." "Permission granted," the captain said. Going through the airlock, Ricky made sure his tools are secured, his magnetic boots are functioning, and then he was able to step out with the outer pressure doors opening. Walking across the hall, he could see the massive damage. In every direction, ships of all sizes and shapes drifted silently in the void. Looking down at his ship, he could see the beating the hull had taken. The ship may be modular, but it might just actually be totaled out with all this damage. Only one weapon seems still functional, but its targeting sensor is just gone. Blown off or knocked off, something is just not there. The comms were in rough shape, and the engines are basically being held together with little bits of wire and good intentions. As he walked across, he can see the pirate ship's hulk coming back after being pulled taut again. Ricky got into position as he could see the others exiting the airlock. Looking at them, Ricky could see tools for fixing the relay and maybe the engines if they're lucky. Real lucky. None of them bothered to get a pack on, as it would take them another hour or so to dig them out of the crushed compartment they were in, which meant no actual spacewalking. They lose grip on the hull, and they will drift in the void until they just run out of air. Ricky saw the ship coming back in, and he prepped himself as the pirate ship got closer and closer. He would have to time this just right. Just as the ship hit his, Ricky turned off his lock and jumped, twisting his way so that his boots touched the enemy hull as he flipped and then hit the lock. And with that, he found himself flipping upwards really, really hard as the ship struck again. With his feet lacking down to the hull, he smacked the back of his helmet before bouncing back up like he was a human-sized weeble wobble. Shaking off the impact and checking to make sure there was no damage, he got to work. The dozen high tensile wires are scattered all over the pirate ship. Moving each one, he used a device called a monomolecular cutter. It is an absolutely wonderful cutting tool, provided the item he's cutting isn't made of a certain heat-resistant material. As it turns out, the cables have this strange material in them, at least for the first few hundred feet. This would not stop Ricky, though. It would just slow him down. As you see, each cable is made of this material, so it can't simply be blasted. Energy weapons don't work. Energy-based tools don't work. And if you try to take the magnetic coupling off, well, you're in for a shock. However, once you get towards the end of the cable, you can actually sever the device holding it. So you'd end up just dragging all these long pieces of cable around until you're able to shed them off. Walking around, he severed each of the cables one by one. He had to move as the ships would collide 4 more times before he's done, cursing the entire way. "Fucking pirates! I hate pirates!" He wished he could just cut the ends attached to the ship. It is well noted that these are reinforced to withstand cannon fire. The cutter just doesn't work as he looked at it, kind of cursing at the device that seemed to work as soon as he got it into the enemy's hull and ripped the mechanism out that held the cable. But it would take time, and eventually he got to the last one. As he was severing the last cable, he knew what he had to do. As the last mechanism broke away from the pirate ship, Ricky squatted down, turned off his magnetic lock, jumped as hard as he can, pushing his tools up towards his own ship. The resulting force gets him to fly at his ship. Though the others are sitting there waiting for him, trying to catch him will get them actually crushed. So they would have to be around him and try to actually tackle him when he hits the hull. Inside, Gorna is actually sitting next to the engineer working on the engines itself. As she hands the engineer the next tool he asked for, they both hear Ricky as he hits the hull with a very loud clunk. They both look up to where the noise came from before the engineer says, for a brick, he flew pretty good. This made her laugh, and laugh even harder, thinking about what they call human ships. By the time the repair crew got inside, a large jump arrived. At first, they thought, oh shit, more pirates. Then a voice came over the comms. This is Captain Pope of the human cruiser Horizon's Light. Beyond the rim, are you in need of assistance? The response was simple. All we can get. This made the crew laugh, but they were glad to actually see friendly ships for once. It would take a long while to attach the ship so that they could travel to human space. As they do, Gorna looked out the porthole to see their saviors. When she first arrived on this detail, she thought to herself how human ships were just the ugliest damn things in space. Now, she can't think of anything more beautiful than that giant brick outside. The jump to human space was not pleasant, as the extra mass meant that things would be a bit bumpy. The crew of both human ships surprised Gorna as she saw them nonchalantly deal with this issue like it was commonplace. What made her actually enjoy the trip and constantly snicker even though she kept saying it was nothing, was hearing the humans talk during all this. Now, to her ears, human talk was always kind of weird. However, now, hearing humans talk while they're being chucked around was being kind of funny to her. Once they reached human-held space, the two ships came out FTL and settled as more ships seemed to arrive. This included several human warships, one so large with so many large weapons, so many secondary weapons, and just plastered with blisters that protected the point defense cannons that Gorna felt a cold shiver run down her spine at the thought. Yet her fears went away as she looked over to the center of the formation. There was a very large First ship. This ship stood out due to its very, shall we say, flamboyant design. Gorna could see the royal crest actually on the bow, meaning that this was actually one of the royal family's personal ships. It is a long process to get the shuttles attached to clear out the crew from beyond the rim. This is required for what was going to happen next. However, the shuttles could not dock due to the insane multitude of cables that were still attached and randomly stuck to the hull. Not to mention that, but the mechanisms that had to be cut off the pirate ships themselves were basically giant bludgeons constantly coming back. The shuttles don't really have thick hulls as a standard ship, so they have to use the much smaller bay to get into to load everybody up. This meant they had to use smaller shuttles, and it just took much longer. Once everybody was out and the engines are shut down, systems are completely shut off, everybody gets ready, as an inverse repulse is charged and a burst is sent through the hull. If this is done with anyone on board, well, they're dead. If any system is on, it's pretty much fried and most likely on fire. With this burst of energy, all the cables attached to the hull immediately detach and begin to simply drift away. They will be collected and repurposed by the locals. After all, it's legitimate salvage. On board the First ship, Gora is being checked by their medical staff. Ricky is next to her watching the process after he gets a few of his blood samples taken as well. He is a bit put back by how luxurious and basically ostentatious this ship is. Even the medical bays are very wide open with thick cushioned beds and a multitude of calming colors and sounds. This made him a bit uncomfortable, as he was, in fact, a true fish out of water. Gorna was exhausted, basically almost asleep during the entire process, yet Ricky was definitely alert. He looked at the medical staff, and though they do not have the same gestures as humans, he kind of could tell something was off. When the First captain and Captain Pope arrived, he clenched her hand very tight, so tight that she opened her eyes and actually told him to calm down a bit. Ricky could see them in the other room through the glass as they talked over there, and Ricky got very nervous as he realized that the Captain Pope wasn't looking over. In fact, he was fighting the urge to turn over and look Ricky in the eyes. They came out a few moments later. Through a translator, the doc told them that the egg Gorna was carrying was not viable. This news hit them both as Ricky is fighting back his emotions, yet his hands were shaking just slightly. The doc explains that even though we believed fertilization was not possible, it did happen. It is of note that fertilization and carrying the egg to term is very different. If not for the increased egg size, her body would have simply absorbed it, seemingly what is done before. It is a very high probability that Gorna's body will break down the egg and cycle as normal. You should be grateful that you'll be back to perfect health. You can. It was at this point that Captain Pope put up his hands on the doc's shoulder and said, "That's enough. We can fill in the rest later. Right now, we should show these two to their temporary quarters." They are then led down a set of large hallways as Ricky holds up a trembling Gorna as she is trying to come to terms with what they just heard. When they enter their quarters, both captains said in their own respective ways, "If there's anything you need," Ricky just said, "We could use a little time." Without words, both captains understood as they looked at each other before leaving, realizing this is something that they just have to get over. As the couple mourned their loss, the Finchi royalty and the humans had a lot to discuss. This event is unprecedented and would take time and research to see if this is just a bump in the road or maybe a new beginning for both their peoples. Gorna and Ricky remained on the ship as they were scanned over and over. Additional samples were also taken to see what may have been the catalyst for all this event to happen. This was actually such a big deal that anybody who might have been outside the ship would have saw something interesting. The human flying bricks actually surrounded the First ship and making an impenetrable wall around it to keep it safe. Many thought the pirates might try something stupid, but the losses taken when facing a simple human cargo ship made all the pirates think more than once about facing even a single human warship. After a few weeks, the couple were cleared to return to their jobs. Gorna was actually offered a higher paying position, but declined unless Ricky would join her. Eventually, there was a deal that they struck. Heading to a new location, it isn't long before they arrive just in time to their new location to see something amazing. Coming out of FTL near a planet in a forgotten zone, which is what her people call a sector of barren hell worlds, they saw massive flying bricks rising from the surface. On the surface, small oceans and rivers flow. Large swaths of green are beginning to cover the landscape, and once thick and violent atmosphere is now clear and calm. This is the very first planet just inside Fortia territory to be made habitable. This new planet was chosen to become a hub between humans and Forshi. This would be their new home. This planet has been christened Cobblestone in recognition of its importance between the two species and in recognition of the human bricks that made it. They look down at the planet and nearly are overwhelmed at the tasks of being planetary governors now. Gornaritia looks out the window at the planet and asks, "How are we going to manage such a massive undertaking? How are we going to build it up to what it needs to be?" Ricky doesn't even look at her as he squeezes her just a little tighter before responding, pulling her close. "The same way we humans always have, brick by brick."